Captain Francis J. Dougherty. My father served in World War II as a naval supply officer. Francis Edward Dougherty, born up in St. Clair, Pennsylvania, coal country. He graduated from St. Joe's Prep, a Jesuit school in Philadelphia in 1926. And I attended St. Joe's as well, but we moved and I finished my high school at the time in Ocean City, New Jersey. Well, periodically he'd come home and leave once in a while, but he'd mostly gone for long stretches of time. And he was in Naval Aviation Supply and traveled all over the place, and I wasn't really sure where he went all the time, but he'd be gone for 6, 8, or 9 months and so forth, and then come home for a week or 10 days and whatever. But that lasted throughout the war. And then when the war was over, he left service as a lieutenant commander and then served as a government service employee in Naval Aviation Supply because he had an expert knowledge of all that and experience. We moved around quite a bit, and at one point we lived here in the local area in Arlington, Virginia, and we also lived in Ventnor, New Jersey, below Atlantic City. My mother used to take me as a little kid walking on the beaches, and all the oil patches would be there, from the sunken tankers and stuff off the Jersey shore. At the time, I was born in 1938, so during the war years, I was 4, 5, 6 years old. And everyone talked about the war. We had air raid wardens in Philadelphia that patrolled around looking for the Nazi bombers in case they showed up. It was just an interesting time, and people talked about the war all the time and how our guys were doing and the various battles and so forth. And so I was, as a young little boy, just picking up peripheral knowledge and information of what was going on with our country. It was an interesting time, though. Back in the day, everything was being saved: tin foil, bacon fat, all kinds of stuff that was cycled into the various war usages and so forth. But it was my impression at the time was it was a whole national effort with everybody still at home here doing their bit to support our guys overseas. I attended. I worked as a lifeguard in the summer in Ocean City and met a lot of guys. I started doing that when I was in high school, my last 2 years in high school. Met guys that were on the force, the lifeguard force, that had attended different colleges and so forth. And of course I had my own ideas of where I may have wanted to attend. But a couple of my friends were Gettysburg students, and I went to the school, liked the campus, liked the history of it, and applied there, was accepted, and I graduated after 4 years of school there. I was a member of the Phi Gamma Delta fraternity, and we had an interesting group of people there from various backgrounds and so forth, but altogether a good group of guys. And I'd say most of my class, each class was typical. I think there were about 20 or so of us in each class in the fraternity. And we'd have 3 or 4 Army guys, a couple Air Force guys, a couple Marine Corps guys, and several Navy guys. So practically all of us who were not married went on to serve the country in one uniformed service or another. My dad served in the Navy, and I had some uncles and so forth that served in World War II as well. And then in this group of fraternity brothers who we would correspond because they were on active duty after graduation, and telling some interesting tales about serving in aircraft carriers and what have you. And it just was kind of the place I wanted to go. And then from Gettysburg College, I went on to Officer Candidate School. It was actually, it was a focused, busy time for 4 months. And when you go to Officer Candidate School, basically you get the academic NROTC career study that takes 4 years, but they jam it into 4 months. And you're a busy person. You started out as an E1, and one of the first things they did was they took us down to a destroyer and gave us a tour of the engine room, and they said, okay, if you flunk out, this is your next duty station. So it was sort of a motivator to maybe get commissioned and do different things, and not that there was anything wrong with engine rooms and so forth, but it was kind of a motivator to hit the books and get your commission and so forth. And so it was an intense combination of academics and a lot of marching, physical fitness type stuff and what have you, but mostly a focus on academics, Navy history, etc., and the various Navy disciplines that you're going to be associated with upon being commissioned and serve aboard ship, or if you're going on to flight school or submarine school or whatever. Well, my parents were very proud of the fact that I was certainly willing to serve, but also willing to serve the United States Navy, because I mean, my dad served in it, and uncles and so forth did too. So it was kind of the thing to do. I wanted to fly, and I passed all the tests and so forth. But at the time, it was going to be a 6 or 7 year obligation, and at 21 and a half and 22 years old, 7 years sounded like an eternity to me. So some of my friends were serving aircraft carriers, and they sent back various inputs about what was going on out there. So I decided to not go to flight school initially. And so I went and served aboard USS Carl C. Home Porter in Alameda, California, made 2 Westpac deployments. It was really interesting because the Carl C. had just come out of a rework. It was a World War II carrier that was a straight deck carrier. And when they recommissioned her, they put an angled deck on it, and it was a beautiful ship. Last of the Midway class CVA 43, and it was a great ship, and it was fun to serve on. And we sailed all over the place, and it was just a wonderful experience. And it was the ship, having just been recommissioned out of an extensive York period, was like a brand new ship. It was really great. I got commissioned in December 1960. Flew to San Francisco on Christmas Day, caught a flight with one of my other OCS classmates. We were serving together on the ship, and we flew from San Francisco, Hawaii, Midway, Japan, and then they flew us down to Okinawa and joined the ship on New Year's Day of 1960. And what was interesting about that, of course, everyone was out celebrating New Year's Eve, and we were just, we got there, I don't know, at 3 o'clock in the morning, because all the revelers were, you know, wrapping up and so forth. And about 6:30 in the morning, everyone got awakened because the ship was getting an emergency sortie underway. So everyone piles out, and an interesting collection of people. Underway we go down to the South China Sea and Gulf of Tonkin, because back in the day there, Laos was kicking off, and so they wanted a carrier out there, and we were out there, and our guys were flying missions and so forth, mostly surveillance type missions. They weren't dropping bombs or anything like that, but that was the first couple of days aboard the ship was kind of a very interesting, just what you'd expect for action in the Navy. I was a communications watch officer and the signals officer for the ship. I was in a ship's company. I wasn't in aviation at the time. We were all division officers, where we had responsibilities for various size of groups of the enlisted guys in their various pursuits. I had the signal gang, and they were affectionately known as skivvy wavers, and up on the bridge and so forth. So I have my responsibilities there as the division officer. I think we had about 20 guys in the division. And then I served as a communications watch officer. You serve 8-hour watches, and sometimes a little bit longer than that. They sort of go not back to back necessarily, but you serve your 8-hour watch, and then you get off for do your other divisional duties and so forth, and obviously sleep, and then do it all over again. And we were involved with highly classified messages and top secret systems that we had to operate and so forth. So it was pretty interesting, and because you could see everything that was going on, because you were reading all the messages and sending all the messages and so forth. So you were really tuned into battle group operations, if you will. And then I did that, and the aviation thing was still in the back of my head, but I got transferred to Fleet Activity Sasebo, Japan, and ran the communications station there for a year and a half, and lived in Japan in 1962 rather. And I then, a friend of mine who was also stationed there, we decided that maybe what we ought to do really is get out of the Navy and go into business on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So I got out of the Navy, and my parents were a little bit unhappy with that, and my friend, he got out a couple months after I did, and off we went to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So our first business venture was to get into the wholesale fishing business, right? So we went to work on swordfish boats off the Outer Banks with the local guys and so forth. So here we are, 2 Yankees, 2 college graduates, 2 ex-naval officers working on these swordfish boats. The hardest, most dangerous work I've ever done in my life. Anyway, long story short, a piece of property became available, and it turned out that my partner didn't have enough money to chip in on the deal because it went from $2,500, a nice little piece of waterfront, to $25,000 when they finally figured out what we were up to. We were going to be the competition for the only other buyer there, right? So anyway, so I'm out there, we're cleaning the 600-pound swordfish while my partner's trying to figure out how he's going to get the money. These two F4s flew over, and I said, I think I'm out of here. So anyway, I got back ashore and got myself cleaned up, got a haircut, shaved, went up to Naval Air Station Norfolk and said, I'm back. So I took the two tests again, played out the two tests and the physical, passed them both. But this time they said, you need an age waiver for pilot training, but would you be interested in the Naval Flight Officer program, because most of the airplanes now have 2 seats in them and blah, blah, blah. So I said, okay, I'll do that, which was somewhat of a mistake. If I didn't say that, I might have gotten the waiver, but I didn't get the waiver, so I ended up as a Naval Flight Officer. When I came back in aviation, I was in VF-11 and on the Forest Gulf. Well, we were going through a training, and so the squadrons at the various bases, we had the F4s and the A6s at Oceana and Virginia Beach, and then the A4 guys were down in Cecil Field in Jacksonville. So they would you do a lot of your local training for your own syllabus of air-to-air type stuff and air-to-ground targeting. So then the Air Wing Commander and his staff would pull together, we get a bunch of airplanes, we do simulated missions and so forth. We use the various target areas, either down in Dare County, North Carolina, or a couple of them down in Florida. So we fly down and operate with those guys out of Cecil, or they fly up and operate with us out of Oceana. And then we do our various missions and so forth. Then when the ship would be out at sea, we'd all go out and do carrier quals, get everybody up to speed on the landings day and night and so forth. And then we would, fly simulated missions and so forth, and have various floating targets. We'd drop bombs and stuff on, or fly to the beach targets depending where the ship was and so forth. And then you go down to Guantanamo and go through refresher training, which is a whole drill for the ship's company as well as the air wing and so forth. And so you get through all that and then go home for a few days, and then you go on your deployment. We deployed from Norfolk to South China Sea, and got out there and we started operating, and we did some close air support stuff with the guys down in South Vietnam, and then we did some night bombing things. This goes back to my comments earlier about if we had mined Haiphong Harbor, right? So we had the worst, scariest mission of all, in a way, not, I guess, scary in a sense. We would drop bombs from a flare. So we'd have one airplane drop at 15,000 feet, and he'd drop a flare which would light up an area, and it would come down and would, had a little parachute and so forth. And then we'd roll in using the light from the flare to drop bombs on supposedly a truck that was loaded up with all the stuff that just got through Haiphong Harbor because it wasn't mined and so forth. So we did that a couple of nights, and we said, yeah, this is stupid. I mean, there's no way to know whether you're actually, it's a guess whether you're going to hit this truck or not, because it's driving through the jungle. We didn't have any sensors that were heat-seeking sensors that could actually find the truck. So it was a wag guess. Plus, a couple guys nearly flew into the jungles and so forth. You get disoriented underneath this flare, blah, blah, blah. So we just knocked that off. But that was a dumb mission. But the other ones were, we would do road recce's and look for targets that were allowed to drop bombs on and stuff. And then the ones at Haiphong were this shipyard facility type things. But we were only there that time for I think we only operated for maybe a couple of weeks before this occurred. I was in VF-11 and on the Forest Gulf. On the particular day of the Forest Gulf fire, we had already gotten up around 5:30, a little breakfast, brief, get in the airplanes. We launched at 8 o'clock and went on one mission to Haiphong Harbor. We were, I think, I forgot the target exactly. It was some kind of dry dock type area. And we came back from that, landed, and we're getting ready to go on the second Alpha strike that was going to launch at 11. And they were kind of back-to-back, a pretty tight schedule. So I was getting ready to go on my second flight of the day when this happened at 10:57, I believe. Got my cruise book here, Forest Gulf and so forth. Happy to share with you. At any rate, it was a dramatic experience, to say the least. Yeah, 10:52, 29 July 1967. We had flown an Alpha Strike to Haiphong, and we were on the flight deck getting ready to go on another one when a Zuni rocket under a stray voltage check ignited and flew across the flight deck, hit a fuel tank on an A4, which started a fire. And of course, we had all kinds of A4s and A6s and F4s loaded with bombs and stuff. I was in an F4 next to the airplane that caught on fire initially. And back in the day, there was a little shortage of bombs and so forth, and we had these World War II 1,000-pound bombs that had a special coating on them that was supposed to allow the bomb not to explode, prevent an explosion for 2 minutes in 4,000-degree heat intensities. Well, the first one cooked off in 1 minute and 34 seconds, based on the Platt clock, and that set off a sympathetic detonation of all the other munitions on all these airplanes. All the guys in those airplanes jumped out, got into the net, got back inside the ship, and we didn't lose any pilots or flight officers in that evolution. The airplane I was in, I used to fly with my skipper. And so we taxied our airplane up on the number 2 Cat, got out of the airplane because it looked like the whole flight deck was going to blow up. And there were 3 or 4 or 5 A6s parked next to the island of the ship with 26 Mark 82s on each one. So it looked like they might be engulfed in this thing too. So we ducked below deck for a few minutes, and then we could feel the ship turning into the wind. So I went back up and took a look, and I said, okay, we can get out of here. So there was about a dozen of us up on the flight deck now, and it was a grisly scene because the ship had turned into the wind, and what we didn't know at the time was the repair party that ran across the flight deck, they were all killed by one of the bombs that went off. However, the hoses that they were carrying, the foam hoses, were perforated and actually set up a foam barricade where there was a lot of fuel running around the flight deck on fire and so forth, as well as the explosion. So that turned out to be helpful. The ship turned into the wind, and fortunately the A6s didn't get caught up in the explosions, just missed them. And then the rest of us were up there helping the various crews download ammunition, missiles and bombs and stuff, and throw them over the side from the other airplanes that were still there that hadn't exploded or been engulfed in the fire. So we then end up officer enlisted on shifts. We fought fires for 3 days, hose teams and so forth. And it was a very exciting day, 3 days rather. And one of the most interesting things that happened was we also had some Air Force bombs, Mark 117s, or 750-pound bomb. A couple of those had gone through the holes in the flight deck, and our EOD team, these guys were lowered down in block and tackles. Very, very scary stuff. These guys are real heroes down there, defusing these things because they were right above the port side rudder and the 2 screws. And fortunately, they were able to do that, and those things didn't blow off, because if they had, probably would have blown the bottom of the ship out, or at least back in the port quarter area. But that was a very exciting day, and we went into a Cuba. They packed the ship up. Took about 10 days, still cleaning it up. Sailed home. Ship went in the yard for 9 months, and I got married on the 1st of June in 1968, and deployed to the Med, or good old Forstall. I was still in VF-11 on the 5th of July, 1968. Welcome to the Navy for my wife. Good news was she got to come over and visit, about halfway through the deployment and so forth. So it was a very interesting time back in that day, and a lot of guys did a lot of heroic things. Well, actually, we had just gotten started, so there were no UHF communications between airplanes at the time. Because we'd just gotten started up. A lot of the airplanes hadn't even gotten started when this happened, and they were just involved in the sympathetic detonations after this one bomb went off. As soon as the first bomb went off, everybody said, this is it, we're out of here. And of course, there was over the 1MC, the main communication systems you can hear all over the flight deck and also internally to the ship. They were talking about the explosions so everybody would know, and then they send to general quarters and so forth, so guys would go to the battle stations and what have you. But there were no radio communications taking place, just internally. My skipper and I, he was the pilot, I was the ex-seer, flight officer, radar intercept officer, and we were just going through our startup checks, turn on. I had a lot of equipment that I had it turned on, and check out and so forth. And of course, he was up front doing the, all the engine checks and control checks and so forth. And that's when I noticed that there was this little fire in this airplane next to us. We weren't sure what it was going to turn into at first. We thought maybe it was just a small fuel dump fire or whatever. And then of course it got bigger, and I said, we better get out of here. I said, they don't have this thing under control yet. And then about a couple of nanoseconds after that, the bomb went off, the first one. And then that's sort of the sympathetic detonation of all the ordnance and all the other airplanes. And as you can imagine, all the airplanes were fully loaded with fuel and so forth. So the explosions would then cause huge fires and so forth, which you'll see in this picture. The launch of this, the inadvertent launch of this Zuni rocket, either hit this tank, caused the fuel to leak out, and I guess from the heat of the missile or whatever, ignited it. So that started that fire. And the repair pros attempted to put that out. Apparently when this bomb, one of these 1,000-pound bombs I'd mentioned to you, sustained enough heat to detonate it, and that started the sympathetic detonation of the rest of the munitions on the airplanes. Well, when we first got out of the airplane, we could see the whole back of the flight deck exploding and blowing up and so forth. And I had a camera with me, which we always took on missions so we could do a little bomb damage assessment, little recce type thing. So I took a number of pictures with this thing. But we didn't want to spend too much time on the flight deck because it looked like the whole thing was going to blow up. And there was a great big tanker airplane sitting up there, which would have really been a spectacular thing as well. So I took the pictures and we jumped down below decks because it was one of those situations where it was like time was of the essence. It would look like, we could be engulfed in this thing at the time. And as I mentioned earlier, when we started to feel the ship turn, I took a peek outside, and it looked like, as I mentioned, the explosions and fires were confined to all the airplanes that were just back in the fantail area, port and starboard side along in that behind the island. So that's when we emerged from. We were only in there for, I guess, a couple of minutes at most. But when we went in there at the time, it looked like the whole thing was going to go up. The whole flight deck. And so we ducked below real quick, and then we came back in after a couple of minutes, and the fires and explosions were contained to the after portion of the flight deck where all the airplanes had been spotted that were going to go on this mission. You could hear them. And there was like a little shudder and so forth, but it wasn't like an earth-shattering type thing, because we were basically probably 750, 800 feet away. We were right up underneath the bow, right underneath the flight deck, and it's pretty hot there, obviously, not just from the fire, but from the weather out there. We were up there for a couple of hours, I guess, so they were rotating through, and there were other things we had to do internally to the ship too, cleaning up various compartments with an awful lot of water damage. And so it was one of those things where everybody sort of chipped in, helping clean up and managing different crews to do different things and so forth. And so we did a lot of that. But as far as it took several days to get everything under control. But all the initial stuff was probably done within hours of the first explosions, because once the bombs went off, and the fuel was what was causing the fires, right, from the airplanes. So that once that either in a combination of being extinguished or burning itself out, the major portions of the fire, as I recall, were pretty much under control within several hours on the flight deck. But there was internal damage that had started other fires that were being fought and so forth. One of the destroyers right alongside of us, here it is right here, pumping water in. Let's see, that was the Rupertus was alongside, and she was fighting. She was using her own hoses to fight fires that were below the port side flight deck, where some of those big bombs I mentioned had dropped through. So she was doing a heroic job, just flying really tight wing on the ship, pumping water into where the fires were. Well, I think everyone was pretty much in shock. There were a lot of portions of the ship that were, the berthing areas and so forth, and some of the workshops were basically uninhabitable at first. But so that was all part of the. Once all the fires and so forth were extinguished, and then it got to be a cleanup mission. to do that. And then we were in port for, I think, the better part of 10 days. They put some steel plates over the bomb penetrations on the flight deck and tested the catapults and the arresting system. And essentially, one of the things that wanted to be proved was that the ship was still serviceable, even though it had sustained a fair amount of damage. And that was demonstrated. And then we weren't going to be staying out there any longer, so that was the end of the deployment for us. So the ship steamed on home and then went to the shipyard for lots of internal repairs. So we lost a lot of airplanes that were just all burned up in the deal. So we got some new airplanes and started training again, and went through the whole process from. We got back. I think we got back by the end of August, I guess, and the ship went in the yard, and we redeployed in July the following year. So the ship was in the yard for about 9 months, and we just went through the whole training cycle again, and went back aboard ship and went to the Med for 10 months. Most people that do this kind of stuff are pretty intent on mission accomplishment and so forth. So we felt, okay, we sustained some significant damage, but we're back at it again, and we're ready to deploy, and we're ready to go. We're ready to go in harm's way, no matter what it happens to be. We're ready to do it again, which is all, I think, part and parcel to the spirit of our people in the Navy and the guys in naval aviation and the ship's company guys that are, hey, we're ready to go. Now, I will say that the results of this particular fire also instigated some improvements in flight deck firefighting and sprinkler systems, and also some additional precautions on how you test various weapons and so forth. And we weren't carrying any more of these warehoused old bombs from WW2, and we weren't using Zunis any longer. So, which was a 5-inch rocket, was quite effective in an air-to-ground type thing for certain targets, but still, the propensity for something like that to cause the damage it did gave severe pause to reusing the darn things. So we weren't taking any of those with us anymore. Well, over a course of 10 months, we went to a lot of places. Went to Naples a number of times. We went to Barcelona a couple of times, Palma de Mallorca, which was a fun place to go. We used to go to Malta, and we used to go into Athens as well. And that kind of a cycle. My favorite one was Cannes, France, at Christmas time. Because remember, I mentioned to you earlier, I got married on the 1st of June, 1968. And deployed on the 5th of July, right? Welcome to the Navy. But anyway, so my wife was able to come over and be with me over the Christmas holidays, and my skipper was he was the senior shore patrol officer, so he selected me to be on shore patrol duty in Cannes. I said, Skipper, I said, my wife's coming over. He said, trust me. He said, it's going to work out great. So I had to stay in a hotel ashore at the nice place on the Riviera there, and so my wife, we had a nice place to stay, and I'd have to work a couple hours a day and so forth, so it turned out great. And so we had a nice sort of a second honeymoon there in Cannes over the Christmas holidays, and then the ship wasn't going to do much in the way of operating. Right after that, was going to make 1 or 2 days and then go to Malta for 3 or 4 days and so forth. So my wife and I went to Zermatt, Switzerland, and skied for 10 days. And one of my fraternity brothers, who was a Marine helo pilot, he had gotten out of the Marine Corps, and he was a Pan Am pilot at the time. So he and his wife they were living in San Francisco, flew to London, and we met them in Zermatt and skied together and so forth. So it was kind of a neat break in a 10-month deployment. So that was good. Then Marilyn flew home, and I continued the rest of the deployment. Well, on the Forrestal deployment, we were still flying F4s, and we had A6s, medium attack, great airplane, could go fast and carry a lot of stuff. And then we had A4s aboard there, and of course an E2 for control and so forth. After the Forrestal, I went to sea duty, or I'm sorry, shore duty, from sea duty to shore duty. And so I went from a sea duty fighter squadron to a shore duty fighter squadron, VF 101, which is the training squadron for F4s. And we were stationed down in Key West, Florida. And then we transitioned most of the training from there back to Oceana, which was kind of an interesting management challenge. I was the schedules officer. This was back in the days before computers and so forth. So we had this great big, as big as this room here, wall that had every guy and every syllabus flight that he was supposed to do, and you had these little grease pencil things to keep track of that. And that was kind of an interesting challenge. So we moved that squadron back up to Oceana, Virginia Beach, and transitioned everybody up there. And then at the end of that tour, which was, let's see, I was in there from late '69 until '72. I went back to sea duty for my department head tour and went into Fighter Squadron 31, which was interesting in that regard. I joined the squadron on Friday afternoon and played handball with the XO, a guy named Jim Flatley, on Saturday. So after that, I'm sitting home and having a beer, and the skipper calls up and says, "Budley, we're not going to the Med next month. We're going to Vietnam on Monday morning." I said, "Wow, okay." And I said, and he said, "By the way," he said, "you're the new maintenance officer," and so forth. I said, "Okay, well, I'll get out to the hangar and start rounding everybody up." He said, "Well, half of them are all on stand down, and they're going to have National Airlines fly these guys back into Oceana over the weekend and so forth, and blah, blah, blah." So that was a really interesting experience. My wife at the time was like 2.5 months pregnant. And so we got all the airplanes back, all our guys back, and we didn't go Monday morning, we flew out Tuesday morning, landed aboard Saratoga, which was home port and main port. Saratoga had kind of an interesting background. It had some issues with some of the ship systems and so forth, but they had gotten all those fixed up and under control. And Saratoga acquitted herself in magnificent fashion out in the Gulf of Tonkin. The ship and the air wing got a number of awards for the service provided, the number of sorties we flew. Ship never missed a commitment. Just everything worked beautifully. In fact, our squadron won the Clifton Award for best fighter squadron in the Navy. So that was kind of neat. But no, Saratoga did a really good job, and there was a little bit of competition between East Coast and West Coast type stuff, as you can well imagine. The guys in fighter squadrons are pretty competitive, and as is all naval aviation. But we did our duty out there and got along great with everybody, and everybody was pretty impressed with each other ships as well as our ship and so forth. So it was a lot of camaraderie there with people. Sailed down the South Atlantic and through the Indian Ocean, and went directly to the Gulf of Tonkin and started flying operations. Our first flying period was 44 days long. We reseated, this is kind of interesting, it goes back a bit. Back in the mid-60s or so, when this whole thing started up, there's only 3 ways to supply North Vietnam and the Viet Cong and South Vietnam. That was through the jungles of Laos, which you can imagine wouldn't get much. The Northeast Railway out of China wouldn't get much out of that. And Haiphong Harbor, which the first cruise we were out there, you could see 30 or 40 ships a day going in and out of delivering Russian goods, which would be then put on barges or the Ho Chi Minh Trail and taken down to the Viet Cong and South Vietnam. John McCain's father at the time was Singpac Fleet, I believe, and he said, "Let's mine Haiphong Harbor to shut that down, because if we shut the supplies down, it's going to change the whole complexion of things." Which a lot of us, and I still think to this day, we would not have had Vietnam as we now have known it, with all the guys that got killed and so forth, if we'd shut that harbor down back in the mid-60s. Well, McNamara, of all people, apparently, the story goes, is that, well, that would be an act of war, right? Well, a lot of us said, well, hey, hello, how about dropping a bomb on something? That's an act of war, too, so give me a break here. Anyway, so they didn't do that back in the day. We went back there in 72, when Nixon was president. The first thing he did was mine the harbor. And so there were 21 ships that were trapped in there, right? And one of our missions, which we didn't care for a whole lot, was to fly up to Haiphong and do a quick take a look to see that they were still there, right? Which was kind of dumb in a way, but that was one of the things we did. But the most, one of the most interesting missions, though, was the mines that were put in there had a time life on them. Their timing was about to expire. So we were assigned the mission to reseed Haiphong Harbor. which involved a very complicated arrangement of, because when you put mines in there, you have to be really precise as to where they are. You know, very persnickety about that. So we had A7s, A6s, and F4s, all with these mines that were basically a 500-pound bomb with the destructor sensor on them, so the ship would light them off. But they had to be put in different places. Well, it turned out that the three airplanes had different sequencings in their intervalometers, which would be the timing for dropping the bombs, dropping the mines. And they had to be, we wanted them to be 500 feet apart because the radius was about 250 feet for each one, so we wanted to have some overlap there. So to get those in there was really kind of an interesting thing. So our group, we had an A6 leader and 3 F4s, one on the port side of the A6 and 2 on the starboard side. And then the deal was when the A6 would roll level, he'd start dropping his mines, so forth. And if for some reason he didn't drop, the first F4 would drop his, and the second F4 would drop his, and the third F4 would drop his. So, well, sure enough, we went there, and you fly up, and we get down to like, I think we're down to 300 feet, and get ready to do this stuff. So the A6, his stuff doesn't come off. So we drop all our stuff. So we said, okay, we'll go back in with you to get the A6's mines in there. So we had the field set up correctly. So we go back in there, and he's doing his thing. Oh, it felt like a kind of a little bump and a thump type thing, you know. What is that, jet wash? No. So we all fly back to altitude, we're heading back. And so our wings said, did you see that sand that blew up right behind it? It was like one of these visual shots where none of our electronic stuff picked up the radiation signals for either their search or track radar, right? And so they used to do these blind shots when somebody just visual, they see an airplane, they shoot one of these missiles at you. So one of those damn near hit us. So that was kind of an interesting outcome of the thing. But yeah, an interesting mission. Well, we were out over the water, and it was a beautiful sunny morning, and the water is beautiful there, and there's some great beaches in the Vietnam area and so forth. So our thing was it was a little bit out into the initial entrances to the harbor. So we weren't over land; we were over the water, and I guess we were probably maybe a mile offshore. Yeah, we used to go, when we could, when the weather was bad in North Vietnam, we used to get vectored down to South Vietnam and do close air support. And we checked in with a FAC down there, forward air controller. And I'll never forget, one day we were down there at Khe Sanh and working with an OV-10. And there was a bunch of Vietnamese down there trying to overrun their base and so forth, North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, I suppose. So they would roll us in, and we'd have 4 airplanes, 24 Mark 82s aboard, 6 on each airplane. So we'd go in and we'd make these runs. We'd drop, wherever the guy said he'd shoot a marker down in there, and we'd drop on the mark on the smoke. And so anyway, we're going around, and he said, I got to get you guys out of here. We got an arc light strike coming in, which is a B-52 strike. And we said, we all have one left. He said, okay, make it quick. So we go in and we drop our last one. I looked up, and the B-52 was at 30,000 feet above us, and you could see the bombs coming out the bottom of it. So we obviously were vectoring out to get out of the way, and but we saw it was like the hand of God just smooshing down this area where all these bombs went off. Unbelievable. But there was all that going on too. The other interesting mission we did on that, the other mission that we did that you asked earlier about what was interesting and significant was we had B-52s were flying out of Guam, and they'd fly up to, it was during Christmas week of 1972, and they would fly up to North Vietnam, and we would rendezvous with them. The Navy was tasked with providing fighter support for the B-52s, and they'd fly up, and we'd join up with them, and they'd fly up the Red River, drop their bombs, do a 180 and fly out the same way, right? Which was, that they lost a lot of airplanes doing that, because usually when we went to Hanoi, we'd go up the Than Hoa Ridge line, and then go in, drop, and go out the other northern, the Hangay Ridge line, so you wouldn't expose yourself to getting shot at too much. Anyway, so the first night we're up there, and in the wintertime out there was an inversion layer, so from the deck to about 5,000 feet was like a big cloud, you know. And it turned out that the B-52, we were up at 25, 30,000 feet, pretty high, as I recall. And when they launched the SAMs, you could see an orange glow in this undercast, which really told you exactly where the darn thing was coming from. And so our guy, the couple we escorted, nobody got hit, nobody got shot down and so forth, but that was a very interesting mission. We got back aboard ship after the first night, we said, hey, these guys are going the wrong way. Who's writing their strike plans? They said, well, SAC, back in Omaha, right? So we'll tell SAC that there's a safer way to get in and out of downtown Hanoi. It took over a couple days to change that, but yeah, that was an interesting week, and I looked in my my logbook here not too long ago, actually, and we were doing that Christmas Eve and Christmas Day of Christmas night of 1972. And the last day, by this time, Jim Flatley, who I used to fly with, he became the CO of the squadron, and I was the maintenance officer, and we used to fly together. And our XO was a really neat guy named Sam Flynn. So the last day, he shot a MiG-21 down. He and Bill John was in his back seat, and they were doing MiG-cap on an Alpha strike, and they shot this MiG down the 44th day of our first line period. That airplane was subsequently transferred through an upgrade program, so it became from an F-4J, it became an F-4S, which they put slats on the airplane for better maneuverability. Then it was transferred to the Marine Corps. So when they recently opened up, well, some years ago now, the Udvar Hazy Museum out here at Dulles, that airplane is on the deck out there, right? But it's got a Marine Corps paint job on it. And they initially wanted to put a MiG-21 symbol as a kill on there. The Navy argued back and forth, said, if you want to put the MiG on that airplane, you got to put the Navy paint job on it. That's still a little food fight over that kind of interesting. But I looked at my logbook, and that airplane, I've got 11 flights in that airplane. So it sits up there. So we got there with the grandkids, I said, hey, I used to fly in that thing. It's kind of neat. So a little history there. So it was a busy time, and it was, you know, a lot of camaraderie. In fact, guys in that squadron, we still have reunions every 5 or 6 years, you know, just to, you know, stay in touch with each other and so forth. And fortunately, we were the only squadron in the air wing that didn't lose an airplane. Got a couple of them shot up pretty bad, but didn't lose one. And nobody got shot down and became a POW. So it was a very intense 10-month combat deployment. And my daughter was born in September. First daughter, Allison, was born in September of '72. And I got home in January to see her. When we got back from that deployment, I had was at towards the end of my tour of the squadron. We started to do workups. I went from maintenance officer to ops officer, and we were getting ready for the next cycle, for the next deployment. So we were home for about a year and a half, I guess, thereabouts. And so my tour of duty was about up, and I'd screened for command. So I left the squadron in the summer of '74, I believe, and I went to the Armed Forces Staff College for 6 months, and I went to F-14 training out in Miramar, and then I reported to VF-14, which is over in the Med, in October of '75, and did XO, CO, which is you do XO is 18 months, and you fleet up to CO for 18 months. So I was in the squadron for 3 years, 18 months each job. No difficulties at all. It's a newer, more complicated, and more sophisticated airplane than the F-14 was than the F-4. But it was just, you know, different knobs and switches, and you just have to learn the systems and so forth. But they're similar in a way, but a little more complicated with the F-14 system. But I mean, just, you know, go to ground school, and you go fly the airplane, you go to the trainers and learn how to do it. JFK had a great reputation, and it was a great clean ship, and it was a pleasure to serve aboard. You know, I was, you know, XOCO of my fighter squadron on Kennedy, and it was a good ship that had some great guys in the ship's company, and a couple of really good guys were skippers of the ship that I knew from prior services, from prior assignments and so forth. So all in all, wonderful deployment on board Kennedy. We did a NATO cruise, the tail end of the Med cruise when I first joined up, and we did a NATO cruise, and we did another full deployment. And I also, I was on, as I mentioned, I was on the bridge team, command duty officer for Connie alongside and so forth. So that was another dimension of good things to do when you're XO and CO of a fighter squadron. You can participate in, handling the ship and so forth. It's really kind of good. Well, the first tour, as I mentioned, I was in the fighter squadron, and we did the usual battle group ops, flying with the French occasionally, and just doing the normal training type things. And one of the most interesting missions on that trip was we were trying to, a guy named Jerry Tuttle was the CO of the ship at the time, and we were trying to prove that we could send airplanes on a 1,000-mile strike mission from a carrier, which is a considerable distance. And so we did a kind of interesting training thing with the Turks. We launched down by Crete and then flew all the way up into northeastern Turkey. A lot of overground flying and so forth. And then got back, and the F-14 was had fan jet engines, economically very good on fuel, and carried a fair amount of internal fuel as well as you could put tanks on it as well. So the airplane had really good legs, so we could do the 1,000-mile mission without a problem. And so that was kind of an interesting type thing to demonstrate and prove. But operating with some of the other navies, the French Navy was, their guys were kind of fun to deal with and so forth, and so that was good. We did some stuff with the Brits. There was a little bit of Russian trawler type activity out there at the time, but it's kind of an interesting job. That some people say it's one of the hardest jobs in the Navy because you have 5,200 odd guys in there when you have the air wing aboard and so forth. So you're serving hot meals 19 hours a day. You're navigating the ship all over the place. Not the XO is navigating the ship exactly, but the ship is going the different evolutions and things. You got underway replenishments, you got to rendezvous with people, you got to go to the different ports, you got to organize that, plus you got 19 direct reports to you. And so there's a lot of things going on all the time, and in fact, if I ever got 4 hours of sleep in a row, I was kind of lucky, But it was a wonderful experience, and you sort of by the end of it, if it works right, which in my case it happened to, you feel as if you just got a PhD in management because you have a lot of balls in the air at all times. And so just the day-to-day action of what goes on an aircraft carrier that you're directly involved in, because the captain is usually trapped to the bridge and so forth. So but the XO is doing a whole lot of stuff for him under his leadership and guidance and so forth. But you're basically, you and your department heads are running the ship, and there's a lot of stuff going on. Now, one of the things we did on this deployment, the ship came out of the yard, we did our workups and deployed, and we knew we were going to spend a lot of time at sea. So I had the supply officer, back in the day there was a rule where after 55 days at sea, you could have a beer, right? So I had him buy, I think it was 20,000 cans of beer. How many cases that turned out to be, I don't know. And so they were put in a special corner down the weapons thing, which was the most secure place on the ship. Right? Anyway, so we had all that saved up because we knew sometime during this deployment we were going to hit the 55-day. So we go to the Med, we operate for a couple of days, and we went southbound through the Suez Canal, which is a very interesting experience. You start off at midnight, and there's like 100 ships go down. We were the lead ship going, it's one-way traffic, so you go down, and when you get through, there's another 100 ships ready to go north and so forth. So that was a very interesting experience, and you could still see going through the canal over along the sand dunes and so forth. There'd be some wrecked vehicles from various wars and so forth. It was very interesting. And then every I think it was every 10 or 20 miles, it was like a little cutout. They had these firefighting boats and rescue boats in there, in case anybody got stalled, tugs and so forth to keep them moving and whatever. But very interesting deployment. So anyway, we get out into the Northeast Arabian Sea. So we're operating out there, flying and so forth. So we hit day 55, right, for the beer day. So it's okay, how are we going to do this? So we cooked up this system where we had some engine gun tubs, filled those up with ice, and distributed the beer. We had these 8 or 10 lanes, right? So, and of course, on aircraft carriers, all these guys, various musicians and so forth. So we had flight deck Olympics, running races and all that kind of stuff, plus all the various bands. You had the country and western band, the jazz group, some folk singer guys, some rapper types, all kinds of, interesting things going on for entertainment and so forth. Plus everyone was out there, getting some sun and what have you. So we had the beer thing all set up, all this beer set up. How are you going to distribute this? So the supplier says, I've got this special colored paper, and we'll put this special stamp on it, right? And so a guy will go through a table, he'll show his ID card, and he'll get his little ticket, and then he can get his beer. They had that thing counterfeited in about 20 seconds. So the guy goes ready, the supplier says, XO, he said, somehow or other this is out of control. I said, what are you going to do? I said, come on, they can't be that far out of control, so somebody's going to have 2 beers instead of 1, so let's just, it worked out fine and so forth. But we were on our way to Australia on that thing, and it took 2 weeks to steam down there. And so we had a very interesting port visit with the Aussies and did some operating with them and so forth. So it was a very interesting deployment. Well, when you go through those cycles, your boards meet and you get your record is reviewed and so forth. So after being XO of a carrier, you're in position to screen, or an air wing commander is in position to be screened for a deep draft command. And so I was screened for command, and I was selected to be CO of a ship. And I went to that ship and had to change of command in Naples, Italy, and it was a great tour of duty. The AFS was an especially fun command because you did a lot of things and you operated pretty much independently. And you just went to all the ships around the Med and service them and provide food, spare parts, and take some of the retrograde things back and so forth. It was right, and also going to some very interesting ports and so forth where you'd reload. I'd go in there and there'd be 250 tractor trailers, and we load the ship back up and go back out to sea and do our thing. So it was great. At the change of command, one of my old buddies, a guy named Bear Taylor, at the time was the CEO of the Coral Sea, which had come through the Suez Canal. It was back in this Beirut time frame, 83 to 85. There's a lot of activity going on there. So they sent a West Coast ship through the Suez to operate in the Med just to have a greater presence there. So Bear was at my change of command, and he said, to answer your question about what's it feel like once you're it, right? Okay, so he said, I'm going to give you a little bit of advice. He said, no matter what they say, you're the smartest guy on the ship. Okay? If you think you're going too fast, you probably are. And the rest of them are all trying to kill you. Let's never forget that. I laughed at the time, but sure enough, about 5 days later, we leave Naples, we go down, and we're going into La Maddalena, where we had a submarine tender, right? So there are a couple of ways to get in there. You get down from the north side through the Straits of Bonifacio, and you go in there, and we go in there and anchor and fly the helicopters and have barges alongside. So, well, the other way is you can enter from the eastern side through a very, very narrow opening. So you're coming in off sea, and you go through this little cut, and then you go into this bigger bay area, and you go anchor and so forth. So I'm looking at the chart here, and I said, have you guys done this before? And they said, oh, yes, sir, we've been in there many times this way. It's really a piece of cake, and it doesn't take long. Right? I said, well, it's kind of narrow. They said, yeah, it is, but there's plenty of room, right? So anyway, so we get out there, and the weather's kind of crappy, so I did a couple of 360s for an hour or so until it cleared up a little bit. So we get through there, and I'll tell you what, I could almost spit on the ground where this thing was so tight from the wing of the bridge. And I said, we're never going through there again. So, but anyway, we had a wonderful crew on there and great deployment and so forth. But it was fun. But you do have that once you're there, you're it, right? So you have that burden of responsibility there. So sometimes you have to make the right decisions, and if you don't make the right decision, some bad things can happen. Fortunately, I had a very successful tour. Oh no, we would do at sea, and sometimes I'd have a carrier on port side and a destroyer on starboard side. And so the replenishment ship's obligation is to maintain course and speed. And the other ships, when they get hooked up and so forth, they maneuver to, you're basically flying wing on the replenishment ship. And then I had two H-46 helos aboard. So I'd be flying helos as well as, like when a carrier did, we'd have 4 wires, and then we'd have 2 helos, and we could do a lot of transferring of lots of food and parts and so forth in a fairly short period of time. But a lot of times we'd be hooked up for at least 3 or 4 hours. Yeah. We used to try to do around 12 knots as a kind of it was a good speed for both ships to maintain position and so forth. And obviously we didn't want to have really big sea states, and once in a while it depended on where you were too, how much sea room you had to keep the ship into the wave fronts and so forth, so you weren't rolling. You know, maybe a little bit of up and down pitching, but you didn't want to get into rolling situations. And it was just one of those things. You'd have to make the call on a given day, and obviously, high sea states you wouldn't do it and so forth. But you wanted to have a reasonably calm sea, not flat water we're talking about, but the normal wave intervals and so forth, so that the ship was controllable and it wasn't rolling a whole lot. And so you could, because a lot of guys were doing a lot of dangerous stuff with it, so these wires hooked up and so forth, and the usual distance that the 2 ships were apart. In fact, that's what kind of intrigued me about this thing was, heretofore I was on Kennedy, and driving the ship alongside one of these things, and you had to maintain position. We'd have the helmsman would have a magnifying glass, so for things, sometimes you're making quarter or half degree course changes, adjustments, just that you're basically flying wing on this other ship. And the interval distance you used to try to maintain is 140 feet, which is pretty close, but comfortable, And you didn't want to get too far apart because then the wires start to get stretched and the ship starts moving a little bit, and you could break the wires and those kinds of things. But so then, being on the control ship, the unrep ship, you're just maintaining course and speed, make sure you don't screw these guys up for a flying wing when you're doing any kind of funny maneuvers and so forth. I had enough food on the Concord enough food for 30,000 guys for a month. I had all these minus 10 below zero freezers and so forth, and I had special forklifts down there to move all this stuff around on pallets and whatever. And but you had the regular run of, I used to go to various ports and set up deals for fresh fruits and vegetables and so forth, because you like to have that in the basic diets and what have you. And then of course we had a lot of frozen meat and fish products, turkeys and all those kinds of things. The normal menu that we have. But one of the neatest things was going to these various ports and I'd send the doctor and supply guys, and they'd go look at these places and see what their products were like and so forth. And it was pretty interesting. The first port we went into to do that was Haifa, Israel. And so my doctor's down there and the supply officer, and they're looking at this, hundreds of pallets, 10 feet high and so forth, with all this stuff. So nothing else to do. I go down there and look around and see what's going on, the new skipper and so forth. So down and take a look, and I said, this vegetables look rotten, right? So I said to the supply guy and the doctor, I said, what are we going to do with this stuff? It's terrible. He said, well, a lot of times we'll just have to survey it, get rid of it. I said, oh. I said, well, we shouldn't even, I don't want any of that stuff on the ship. We're not paying for this crap. So I said, who organizes this? So they introduced me to the husbanding agent, right? So it was his company. I said, really? And I said, again, then they explained, they got picked by, the embassy and so forth. They had various purveyors that would get supposedly qualified. So I got all this guy, I said, let's take a walk, just you and me. So we're walking up, showing him all these rotten vegetables and so forth. I said, I don't like the looks of this. And I said, would you eat that? And he said, yeah. I said, we got to do something about that. And he said, well, we already have it all the way down here. I said, look, it's already down here, but I said, it's not going on my ship. I'm not going to feed that to my buds on these carriers and other ships and my own crew, and so I was not going to do that. And I said, he's got kind of a funny look on his face. And I said, if you don't like that, I said, I'll go back aboard here. I'll call the embassy and tell them that, get somebody else. He said, I got it. So he starts yelling at all those guys, get rid of all this stuff. They took every bit of it away, right? truckloads of stuff. Came back the next day, it was beautiful, nice, fresh stuff. So it was an interesting experience. But I wasn't about to, pay good US dollars for a bunch of junk, So, anyhow. Well, yeah, the Earl Weapons Station is in Colts Neck, New Jersey, which is a very nice area. And I think the thing was started back in the early days of World War II. And they had all kinds of ammo storage places there, and had an own railroad that went, I think it was 12 or 15 miles, down to a little town on the waterfront called Leonardo. And if you ever flown into LaGuardia or Newark, and you see Sandy Hook, which is a pronounced thing, right next to Sandy Hook is this 3.5 mile long pier. And that's where the ammo ships were home ported and based. And I had small headquarters and small staff ashore in Leonardo. So all the supplies would come down the railroad in boxcars and so forth, unload onto the pier, then onto the ships, and the ships would then deploy. I guess the reason the pier was 3.5 miles long was the fact that if one of the ships blew up, just little pieces would hit the beach. But anyway, it was a very interesting place, and it was an interesting tour of duty because we were building a lot of housing there for the crews and so forth. There was some opposition to that. I think, fortunately, gotten to know a lot of the local politicians. Would give them ship tours, take them, have them fly them out to one of the ships that was coming in and so forth. So they got a little acquainted with what was going on there. And they became a big help when we had some of these protests about this housing thing that we're going to do for our enlisted guys, because it was a very expensive real estate area to live in, and limited housing for the crews and families of these ships. So we were able to make that happen. It worked out good. We had 5 ammunition ships there that would load up from the Earl Weapons Station and then deploy with battle groups and service the battle groups and so forth around the world. So a very interesting tour of duty as well. I got involved with the New York Navy League. This was back in, I was up there from 86 to 88. And the guy that was head of the New York Navy League asked me if I thought that a Fleet Week in New York would be an interesting thing to do. He said they used to have one years ago, but it stopped. And he said, would I be willing to help him? And I said, yeah, that's a great idea. I'll be happy to help you. So he said, well, he'd been talking to the guy over at the shipyard, and they said that maybe they could send a couple destroyers up from Norfolk. I said, no, you need an aircraft carrier. This is New York, right? He said, exactly. That's why. Can you help me? So I called down to Vice Admiral Dick Dunleavy, who was Commander Naval Air Forces Atlantic at the time, explained the story to him, and he said, oh, yeah, great. I'll send the Kennedy up there, my old ship. So the Kennedy shows up for Fleet Week in 1987, and they had 50,000 visitors a day, and the rest is history. So that was kind of a fun thing to get involved in. And after that tour, I went to the Pentagon, and I was a deputy in Op 50, which puts together the plans and requirements for naval aviation budgets and so forth. And did that for 2 years. I got my look for flag. Didn't make it. So I had 2 kids in grade school, oldest daughter in high school, and so I needed a new career. So I retired in 1990 and worked in aerospace for 15 years. And then I did a startup from one consultant to 18 employees by the time I finished, in kind of a very interesting recall mitigation for small arms. So I did that and retired when I turned 71. And I got myself busy by running for the board of the club I belong to, Washington Golf and Country Club, one of the oldest country clubs in the country. And ended up being the project officer and built a $4 million fitness center, which was kind of fun along the way. And I served as president of the club after that, which was kind of an honor and a privilege to do so. And live here in North Arlington with my family and my wife and 3 daughters, and it's just, a great run. Just turned 81. My youngest granddaughter, she turned 6 when I turned 81.